Greetings and salutations. You are tuning into The Disgruntled Millennial, and as usual, I'm your host, Brett Siegel, where I always broadcast to you not live from my safe space down here in northern Florida, where I am always free from your bigotry, racism, sexism, hatred, microaggressions, and patriarchy. Well, it rained pretty bad yesterday. My cat got scared, pooped all over the floor, causing a chain reaction that potentially led to a global calamity. So, of course, I took to the streets to protest the fossil fuel industry. Sounds absolutely ridiculous, right? Well, not really. Every time there's a strong storm or an unusually hot day, green people take to the streets to protest the evils of fossil fuels, insisting that each of us ought to curb our energy use for the sake of the environment. These foolish people would be pretty easy to marginalize were it not for the vast efforts of our government to stifle the use of our most precious resource, which is fossil fuels. Today, I'm here with Alex Epstein. He's the author of The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, which has been widely praised as the most persuasive argument ever made for the use of fossil fuels. He also founded the Center for Industrial Progress, a for-profit think tank focused on energy and environmental issues. And I wanted to say welcome to the show, Alex. It's really great to have you.
Looking forward to it.
There's a lot to talk about, and I want to give my audience a little bit of an introduction with sort of a glowing book review. I'm not going to give too much away, but I must say that when I finished reading your book, it was sort of like the way I felt. The way I felt was sort of the way I felt after I read Atlas Shrugged. I was alarmed, but I had a very heightened sense of my surroundings. After reading your book, a simple trip to the grocery store took on sort of an amplified meaning as I tried to imagine every single way that my life has been kissed by fossil fuel energy. And your book really concretizes the extent to which our lives utterly depend on fossil fuels, and even simple tasks such as making eggs in the morning. If you do the thought experiment sort of required to sort of finish out the book in proper form, it just requires these gargantuan expenditures of energy that people rarely think of. But with fossil fuels, it is all at our fingertips. So with that in mind, let's start right from the top. Why make an appeal to morality when it comes to fossil fuels?
Well, I think, first of all, morality is in every realm of action, because the whole subject of morality is what is the right kind of human action. And in energy, it's pretty obviously involved because people have the idea that it's immoral to use coal, oil, natural gas, and also many believe nuclear power and hydroelectric power. And so what they're saying is that this is the wrong path forward. That by some important moral goal, and we'll talk about what that moral goal is in a second, but by some important moral goal, using coal, oil, and natural gas is really the wrong thing to do. Now, I have a moral goal of I want human beings, including myself, to flourish, and so it's vitally important for me to know whether using fossil fuels is promoting that goal or opposing that goal. And the kind of range of possibilities are they could have the same goal that I have, and they could be getting it right. They could have the same goal that I have and be getting it wrong, or they could have a different goal than I have, and they could actually be getting it right.
Right.
But it's wrong for human beings. And it would, and you hear rhetoric that might indicate this, and this is what early on bothered me even before I knew about fossil fuels, where people would say something like, the planet will be better off without humans. Right, those kinds of things. So human beings are a cancer, and then you think, wait, if we're better off without us, then obviously we can't be the object of better. And then one of my favorite lines ever on the subject was by economist George Reisman. He said, he's talking about scientists who say that they're against fossil fuels, and he says, well, first you have to know what their goal is. Because you could have the best doctor in the world in terms of technical knowledge, but if he's on the side of the germs, then you don't want him as your doctor.
So basically what your book says is that human flourishing is the standard of value by which we should judge whether or not fossil fuels is the proper way to move forward, correct?
Yeah, whether that's a vital source of energy and when and how we should use it. And the conclusion of the book is that overall we should be using more fossil fuels, not less. That if used in the right way, that is going to be crucial to humanity flourishing going forward. But the key idea of moral case for fossil fuels, you could replace moral with human. And so what I'm arguing is that if we really use human flourishing as our goal, then fossil fuels are good. But the implication of that is that a lot of us in our thinking, whether deliberately or not, are not using human flourishing as our goal. And when we're thinking about things like the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, we're not really looking at overall how putting more CO2 in the atmosphere and getting a lot of energy, whether that's really good for human flourishing or not. We have a premise that actually we shouldn't be impacting the atmosphere.
Right.
Our real goal is to impact things as little as possible, and that's the main reason why we don't want CO2 in the atmosphere. And for me, that's not the human flourishing goal. That's a non-impact goal, and that's we can discuss, but that's ultimately an anti-human goal to not want to impact nature at all.
Right. Now, you say that fossil fuels is the industry that powers all other industries. What exactly does that mean?
Well, so the broader idea is that the energy industry is the industry that powers every other industry. And then one of the things the book explores is the fossil fuel industry uniquely good at producing cheap, plentiful, reliable energy on the scale of billions, which is what's necessary in a world of 7.5 billion people. And I argue that it is. But the first point to get is just that energy production as such is what's necessary for every machine in our society to function. And the key distinction between us and poor people economically is that we live in a machine labor society instead of a primarily manual labor society. So we get machines to do our work for us. The more machine servants we have, the more productive every given human being can be, the more prosperous they can be, the more opportunity they have to flourish. Right. So if energy is the thing that fuels every machine, it fuels every aspect of our life, including all the other industries. So if you say, well, I don't like the fossil fuel industry, I'm not too concerned about energy, but I love iPhones.
Right.
Well, the production process of the iPhone involves a lot of high energy machines, from the time that the aluminum gets brought up from the ground to, the UPS truck that ships it to your house. And so you have to realize that every process of production involves energy production. So you really better care whether we have efficient energy production.
Right. It doesn't really take a lot of digging to see where the rationale breaks down. Whether or not the opponents of fossil fuels take a human-centric mindset or an Earth-centric mindset, to be opponents of fossil fuels, sort of, it doesn't follow even in their own reasoning. Why do you think it is that people have this anti-Earth mindset, and then once we sort of disregard that or debunk that, we can sort of we can get into what it actually means for human flourishing? But where do you think this anti-human mindset comes from, and how deep do you think it is embedded in our society to the point where we have people who are literally going out there and hugging trees while at the same time, supporting the killing of people in the fossil fuel industry, trying to accuse people in the fossil fuel industry of crimes against nature, crimes against humanity?
So let's just talk for a second about what the view is. And I think it's important to characterize views primarily in terms of what's the moral goal of the view, because that's going to then serve as the standard by which you judge every decision. So it's the goal that's the most important thing. And the goal of being green, or what you call being Earth-centered, which is a good way to put it, is that the goal is to minimize our impact on nature, to minimize our impact on the Earth. And you say, well, if you just look at that straight and you try to apply it, and I think you should try to apply every philosophical idea somebody tries to give you, you say, well, should we have taken a patch of dirt and trees in the Northeast United States and turned it into New York City if we want to minimize our impact on the Earth? Well, no. Well, should you have a child? Well, that's the worst, right? To self-replicate is to create an unlimited potential stream of Earth impactors. And then you look at an overhead map of the world and you say, well, which is a more moral country, North Korea or South Korea? Right. You see North Korea in the dark, and it's like, well, they're doing a really good job, by the standard of not impacting the Earth. So this is, and not coincidentally, they also have a much worse environment. So it's not that this is somehow getting us a good environment. It's about the environment as a God that's over and above human beings and that we sacrifice to. So it's very important that it's not about environmental quality. One of the reasons why people buy into it is because they think, oh, environmentalists, they want a good environment for me. And the environmentalists will just talk about, oh, we care about clean air and clean water. But for them, it's not about you having clean air and clean water.
Right.
But on the earth premise, that's just another thing that we do to impact the earth. But it's about the earth getting hurt, not about us getting hurt. Whereas in the human flourishing framework is the exact opposite. It's we don't want pollution because it hurts us, right? Not because it hurts the ground, right? Or because it changes the ground. So feel free to ask about that. But that's important to know that that's the perspective. Then we can talk about what the rationale
Absolutely.
is.
But one of the things I find kind of alarming and disturbing about the way people oppose fossil fuels is that a lot of folks they don't even really think in terms of what their standard of value is. So depending on the day, depending on the moment, depending on who they're talking to, they'll switch their standard of value. In one moment, they'll say, well, the environment has implicit value. And in the next moment, they'll say, well, we need clean air and water for our future generations, or we need clean air and clean water for us right now. And it really just, to me, it adds a little bit of a sinister aspect to it. You know, I watched your testimony in front of the Environment and Public Works Committee, and one extremely smug Senator Barbara Boxer asked you, "Are you a scientist?" And you responded, "Well, no, I'm a philosopher." And then I just wanted to reach through the screen and go, "Are you a scientist, Barbara Boxer? You were a stockbroker before you had tenure in Congress, you know?" So and she was just chastising you as if to say that philosophy had literally no place on the Senate floor, which our founding fathers I'm sure would disagree with. And and especially in the fossil fuel debate, and she said, "I don't appreciate being lectured about science from a philosopher." And all I could think of was, "And I don't want to be lectured about philosophy by a stockbroker." And of course, Barbara Boxer's career was suicidal environmental policies were a staple of her career. So to me, it just on a larger note, what she displayed was how vacant our thought leaders are in the realm of philosophy, that they can just switch their standard of value from here to there, and then not even sort of understand that, we call them thought leaders, but they reject philosophy, which teaches you how to think, how to have thoughts. So help us understand why philosophy can add a deeper sort of nuance to the fossil fuel debate.
So I tried to explain this to Senator Boxer. So my immediate response was, she said rhetorically or hypothetically, without expecting a response, well, why would we need a philosopher? And I said, I'm here to help you think more clearly. And her staff laughed at her when I said that, and people thought it was funny. And it was funny in a certain sense, but it's definitely exactly why I was there. The whole purpose of philosophy is to teach you the fundamentals of how to think clearly about every aspect of life. And one of the premises of having philosophy as a discipline is that this is not automatic in the least. So the idea of having an explicit moral goal, which we then use as the standard by which we evaluate every decision in a given context, or even every decision in life, that is not an automatic thing. It's not automatic to know that that's necessary, and it's certainly not automatic to do that. And this is a way in which many innocent and honest people who don't have the right philosophical framework and who don't think enough in terms of philosophy, haven't been taught to think so, they easily buy bad ideas that are packaged with good ideas. And the philosopher Ayn Rand, author of Atlas Shrugged, which you mentioned before, called this the intellectual package deal. So, for example, the idea of minimizing impact packages together being anti-pollution and being anti-development. But being anti-pollution is on a pro-human standard, and being anti-development is on an anti-human standard. So if you have a clear moral goal that's helping you organize your thinking, including the very concepts you form, the words you use, then you'll see minimizing human impact. That's not the right way to think of it because it's a package deal.
Right.
I want clear terminology that helps me. So then you'd think in terms of maximizing, say, environmental improvement, right, which would be pro-development because we're improving our environment for us, and anti-pollution because we're minimizing pollution for us. So a lot of people have very positive reactions to the moral case for fossil fuels, and sometimes they think that it's because the book has a very complete accounting of the facts, which I think is true. I think it is the most complete accounting of the facts. But even the reason it has a complete accounting of the facts is because it has a clear goal, right, which is human flourishing, and a clear methodology, which is that we need to look carefully at the whole picture, both positives and negatives, and thereby it includes all, I believe, the essential relevant facts for judging this issue by the standard of human flourishing. But so even having the right facts and knowing how to use them, right, requires a philosophical framework. So I have one refrain to audiences, which is, I come from what is regarded as the most useless profession, being a philosopher, and you never had a problem in life and said, right, let's call a philosopher. And I said, well, now it's time to.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And that just gets me back thinking, when I finished your book, I was actually getting over a cold, and just how much more just terrible and awful that cold would have been without a world of fossil fuels. I don't know if I would have survived it. Something as simple as going to the grocery store. We think a lot of the times we think in terms of just simply the gas that we put in our car, but it's not just that. There's more fossil fuels in the components of the car than actually fit in the gas tank, as you point out in your book. And not just that, I mean, just every little thing, the plastic buttons on the keyboard, the plastic on the shopping cart as I walk through, the display cases, everything is powered by fossil fuels. And the case that you make is such a visceral case for the morality of it, that if you were going to start, if you're going to start hacking away at our freedom to use energy, you're basically hacking away at the extra time that we have to self-actualize, to even have these sort of doubts about fossil fuels in the first place.
Yeah, I agree 100%.
So let's talk a little bit about one of the things that you just mentioned, which is that anti-pollution and development are not mutually exclusive. Let's unpack that a little bit for the audience, because that might seem a little bit counterintuitive. The more we develop, the more environmental impacts there are going to be. If you don't really think too deeply into it, you might buy into that logic. And like you said, well-intentioned people who just want what's good for humanity or for the world or for whatever their standard of value is, well-intentioned people get duped into these very suicidal thoughts, which are a world without fossil fuels. It's just suicidal.
I think we need to be on the premise that the words we use should be clear guides to action. It can't be that the words we use are just like the worst legal document ever, where we have absolutely no idea what they mean. And so we just say, oh, well, you know what I mean. So if you say, I want to minimize human impact, then I take that literally. I mentioned the issue of no New York City, no kids, North Korea is better than South Korea. So if we start taking words literally, then when we find a problem with our existing ideas, the solution is not to rationalize it and to say, you know what I mean. It's to come up with better words, better concepts for guiding ourselves. But if we take literally the idea of minimizing human impact in North Korea, I ask the question, which environment is better for human beings? Leave aside even just poverty and not having stuff. Who has the better environment? Who has cleaner water and cleaner air and better sanitation, right? Which place do you want to try to take? If someone says you can try to take a drink of water in North Korea or South Korea, which place are you going? Yeah, South Korea. And in most poor countries, in terms of air quality, they have super local air pollution, indoor air pollution. From wood and from dung. That's 2.7 billion people cook their food using wood or dung. So you see that you look at this and you think, okay, there's something wrong with the idea that a good environment is the one that has as little human impact as possible if you care about humans. if you think that the environment is something, it just means everything but humans, and you care about everything but humans, sure, almost by definition, it's better off. Of course, that's not even true, because everything we do is going to benefit some species and not others. But if you care about human beings, obviously the minimal impact view is wrong, and then you have to ask why. And it's pretty straightforward. It's because human beings by nature are impactors. Every species is, but we're very good at it. Right? We survive by impacting nature, by transforming it to meet our needs. So to be against impact is to be against our very means of survival. And when I learned this point when I was 18, I immediately deeply hated the environmentalist movement, and that never abated, because it's, I really love human productivity. Of course, human life more broadly. And this is just an attack on everybody who finds a way to make the earth a better place for human beings. So impact is fundamentally a good thing. And then the only thing is we want to impact it in a pro-human way. So pollution is an anti-human form of impact, all things being equal, that you want to minimize. Now, it's not that, and even there are questions of, there are thresholds at which certain levels of emissions are perfectly safe and there's no problem, but there are also levels of, certainly you can put a certain amount of contaminants in water and people will get really, really sick. And that's a problem. And to the extent possible, if you can solve it without making a lot of other things worse, you should absolutely do that. But this idea, we have to get rid of the idea of environmental impact is bad. I have trouble getting people to really stop using that, but the idea of environmental impact is bad is wrong. Now, environmental impact is not 100% good. That's not the right way to think of it. But you can say we want to do environmental improvement, or the most technical term is we want environmental mastery. That's really what we want. Environmental
and of course,
mastery.
it all depends on the context of the impact. But not just that. I mean, a lot of these anti-fossil fuel folks will be super duper quick to say that that human flourishing, human impact is unnatural. Well, why isn't human habitat, like a civilization, any more unnatural than an ant hole in the ground, or like a lion's den, or something else like that? I mean, just like you said, we just happen to be way better at it, at forming our environment. But it's not like we're above and beyond nature. It's not like we don't belong to nature as well.
Yeah, I think that's a great mentality. I think of it as, if the Martians, the mythical Martians, were looking at this planet, would they say, as environmentalists say, "Oh yeah, those humans ruined it. Like, they made it so bad"? And I think they'd say, "No way, they build the best nests. Like, those are like, we look at the T-Rex." That's so it's such a, so you think about the premise then, their view of natural is really non-human nature. So everything that's not human is good. That's all you have to be good in their view, is not a human. And everything that's human is bad. So I call them human racists, because they're against the human race, which is worse than a regular racist, right? Because at least a regular racist claims to like some humans. Right? Whereas a human racist likes
absolutely.
No
and if I were the Martian, and I passed by this planet, I'd be like, well, it could survive life, but it's just a bunch of green. Nothing to see here, I would pass right along. I'd go to the next solar system. Now let's sort of take the opposite side of the coin. Now we got these protesters out, these Earth Day protesters. You're raping Mother Earth, and they use all these awful inflammatory devices. Now let's say paint a picture for our green friends so they can truly understand how hypocritical they are. Hypothetically speaking, if green people from around the world were to gather in Washington in D.C. and protest the fossil fuel industry, in what ways would these protesters have to use fossil fuels in order to organize and successfully implement such a protest? Just so we can understand how any effective protest is going to require them to basically implicitly prove that everything that they believe is a lie.
Well, so I don't necessarily agree with all the premises of that question, because so you could imagine a scenario in which we should talk about the CO2 issue soon, but we're in a scenario where the forms of energy we were using now were somehow entrenched for illegitimate reasons, and causing disastrous short and long-term consequences. And just because of this, this conspiracy or this whatever is going wrong to prevent us from using superior sources. So if you say, well, superior sources are right around the corner, they're available, but we've basically have been deprived access to them, so we're going to use the bad sources to go protest them so we can get the good sources soon. This is what they claim. At least it's important to at least understand that some of them at least understand that they're using fossil fuels, but the premise is, well, we're getting here to use fossil fuels because in the long run, that'll lead to yet less use of fossil fuels. But then you really have to, if that's your position, you really have to think critically and ask questions like, well, why is it that in every country in the world to get to these protests, we use lots and lots of fossil fuels?
Right.
So to get to your question, you think about, it's just so many aspects of it, but most obviously just the fuel needed to get there, and then all of the synthetic materials are derived from oil and gas, and then everything that's manufactured. And so even if you're driving a Tesla there, it's probably a coal car or a gas car or a car, manufactured with massive amounts of fossil fuels, and every single input is. And what's happening is that the input from in every aspect of the process, unless people are voluntarily choosing to pay more, are being made using the lowest cost form of energy, which is almost always fossil fuel. So you really have to think, how could it really be that there's this massive, massive conspiracy that's quote unquote forcing me to do this? Because I've interviewed them and they'll say, I have to do this. And well, do you really have to? You could walk, you just don't want to. And if these other technologies are so great, America's still a pretty free country. Why can't you use those? So I think it's not that it's a completely incoherent thing, but I think the ubiquity of fossil fuel in their protest of fossil fuel indicates that there is an extreme value of fossil fuel that is very difficult, if not impossible, to replace in the next several decades, and that they had better acknowledge that. What you notice is they don't say, yes, fossil fuel provides this amazing caliber of cheap, plentiful, reliable energy for billions. Unfortunately, there's this tragic consequence. They never talk anything about the benefit. They have no appreciation, and they gleefully talk about, shutting down oil companies and ending coal mines and all of these other things. And so here's the thing, the fact that they acknowledge no benefit and no importance to the benefit that they are directly getting from fossil fuels to bring them to their self-proclaimed important mission indicates that they do not value the positive of cheap, plentiful, reliable energy production, and strongly indicates that their position is not going to look at the whole picture of what it would mean to lose fossil fuels or to heavily restrict them.
Ask an environmentalist to get that introspective, and you're doing something that is pretty much impossible. Now, just like the massive regulatory machine of Obamacare ultimately priced a lot of people out of the healthcare market, you refer to something called climate poverty, where government regulations basically price people out of being able to satisfy basic energy poverty. Basically, these government regulations that stifle fossil fuel production, they basically end up preventing people from satisfying their basic energy needs, such as in Germany. Can you help us unpack that idea so we can understand the real ramifications of the green agenda?
Sure. So if we have this idea that energy is the foundation of a machine labor civilization. So every little bit you can decrease the price of energy is going to increase human productivity. And so it's going to matter for everything in life, from a vacation to Hawaii to a farmer being able to use a diesel-powered tractor to put food on the table for his family, right? There's this whole continuum of things, and everything benefits, all things being equal, from more affordable energy, as long as it's reliable, and then everything gets hurt when it goes up. So you can imagine those Walmart falling prices that you see in those commercials, and you think about, okay, when the price falls, the price of everything in Walmart falls, right? Ultimately, the price of everything falls. And when it rises, the price of everything in Walmart rises. Now, Walmart is a place where often fairly low-income people go to shop, right? So you can think of, well, if the Walmart prices rise, that's going to be more of an immediately painful impact than if the yacht owner's prices rise, right? I don't want his prices to rise either, but it's just a more visceral thing if you're on the margin. And now if you take the fact that American Walmart shoppers are incredibly rich by the standards of the world, and you think about, okay, well, what if their equivalent of Walmart, their ability to purchase things, to do things, if their prices go up for everything in their lives, then they're really, in very visceral ways, not going to be able to get enough food, not going to be able to get healthier food, clothing, shelter, all of these things that depend in terms of their affordability on cheap, plentiful, reliable energy, they go down. So this phenomenon of energy poverty means a very significant portion of your income goes toward energy expenditure. And that also means that a very significant portion of the nation's income in terms of its economy is going toward energy. And the more that's the case, the less you can afford, the less productive you can be. And so that means that people in Germany who are paying a lot of money, because it's not that the coal plants are being replaced by solar and wind, which are properly not called renewables, but unreliables, right? If they're not being replaced because the unreliable can't replace reliable, they are just being supplemented by the unreliables, which adds a lot of dead weight and a lot of instability to things. Well, that's going to jack up people's energy prices, and the poorest people get hurt the most. So the idea of energy poverty is when you raise energy prices, the poorest people get hurt the most. And thus, those who talk about raising energy prices have absolutely no right to say, oh, we really care about the poor people because their temperature might rise 1 degree or whatever they claim to be preoccupied with.
I often think of, I think of that exact same thing when I'm, going to the store, and after reading your book, just all the different layers of fossil fuel energy use, going to this, going into one place that's sort of where everything converges, all these different products from all around the world. It's such an amazing thing, and every 10 years or so, we get a different story from the environmentalists, whether it be that the Earth is warming, then it's cooling, and then it's warming again, and now it's climate change. And they keep on shifting the language. Every 10 years, the sky is falling. I sometimes lament at what could have been during this time. I don't know if you often think of, because of all the propaganda and all the energy policies that have sort of come our way since the 60s and the 70s. Imagine what kind of world we could be living in now. And you're right, it is a little bit rich for all these environmentalists to claim that they care about people who are poor, especially when they say that from their ivory towers. And, not even really thinking or considering the philosophical ramifications of what it is that they believe in. Now, one of the things that you discuss in your book is several fallacies that are sort of used to bludgeon people who support fossil fuels. And since you're a philosopher, I wanted to sort of, I know it's a little bit wonky, but I kind of wanted to get kind of down into the weeds so my audience can sort of understand how they can approach their environmentalist friends next time they get, next time their friend says, oh, well, you know what? I heard that one sink caught on fire because of fracking, therefore we should ban the entire fracking industry.
Right.
So let's start with, you have 4 fallacies that you mentioned in your book. So you started the abuse-use fallacy. It's basically used to attack anything it's basically used to attack a group because of singular incidents. So I'll let you sort of, take the floor on these since you're the expert in the matter.
So let's say you hear that fracking or shale energy is causing earthquakes, and even, let's say, dangerous earthquakes, which I don't think is true, in certain parts of Oklahoma, right? So people say, well, I'm against fracking. We should ban fracking. They'll see that story and they say we should ban fracking. And I say, well, this seems very odd to me, because if it's that fracking in certain parts of Oklahoma is dangerous for local reasons, then at maximum, wouldn't you just not allow it there because it'd be breaking the law there? But why would you restrict it in places where there's no connection to earthquakes at all? So there's this idea that if something can be abused or misused, then it shouldn't be used at all. And so this is if you have this, of course, you can be against anything. You can watch them. There's some really good footage of a wind turbine just completely going up in flames on Facebook right now. Then you say, well, if that can be misused, then it shouldn't be used. So this is just a fallacy. There are many of these fallacies that are used that are universal opposition fallacies. That is, they can be used to oppose anything. And so you just have to be aware that how disingenuous it is, that somebody's just using them because it's an easy way. And you just want to ask them, well, really, why is it that because this can be abused that it should never be used? And what wouldn't that be true?
We have the false attribution fallacy, which claims that one event causes another, basically without any proof whatsoever. For example, the faucet fires from the fracking.
Yeah, so you hear a lot of claims about, or let's just take an air pollution type claim you hear. Arnold Schwarzenegger wrote some prominent Facebook post, and lots of people say this. So just throw around, well, fossil fuels kill 5 million people a year through air pollution. And it's really remarkable that we just believe this because we hear it. Because if you think about, well, okay, what would you need to prove that something kills 5 million people a year? What does that even mean? That it's just the fossil fuels they're killing them? What does it mean, kill them? Like they die 20 years early, they die 20 seconds later? Like, what exactly is this? So in science, the idea is you want as much causation as you can get. You want to be able to see, okay, this thing is a consistent driver of this bad thing. And as a consumer, you have to be aware that it's very common for people to take just certain kinds of correlations involving things they don't like and then correlating them to bad things. So you can have one, advocate of one diet finding correlations to show that another diet is having bad consequences. So sometimes the correlations can be true, and correlation can give us a lead to causation, but by themselves, without a really clear isolation of causality, they're not at all legitimate. So I just think in general, when you hear X causes Y, you just have to ask why. You have to ask, why is that? And then the other thing you have to do is you have to integrate it into the whole picture. So, for example, let's say that in China, the smoke from coal or smog from coal subtracts on average 30 minutes from everyone's life. Well, you might want to look at, okay, what's the overall life expectancy trend? Well, certain major cities in China that have a lot of smog, it's higher than in the U.S., right? It's gone from 6, so we have 10 plus years life expectancy increases in recent decades. So you better take that, if you claim to care about people's lives, you better take that into account. And as you're doing it, you should also take into account part of the whole picture is what are our options? If we're having a problem with something, we can often technologically improve it, say by not having random furnaces in China just burning coal in the open for no reason because of government policy. Like, there are often technological solutions. So the whole picture with human flourishing as the goal, that gets you to the right answers. Whereas what's happening here is these out of context claims that are using fallacies. But the ultimate fallacy involved is not looking at the whole picture of human flourishing. And if you do that, it'll help you just find these fallacies all over the place, but also to give people a better way of thinking.
You also have that's absolutely right, and you also have the no threshold fallacy, which basically says that because if I stick my face in a smoke stack and breathe heavily, and I die from that, well then all pollution is bad, even in smaller concentrates, smaller particulates.
Yeah, so even to call it pollution, to call something pollution really implies a demonstrable health risk. There's this idea, and this goes to the fallacy that human impact is bad, that any human emission, that any human byproduct is necessarily bad. And that's just simply not true. I mean, even if you look at CO2, it's obviously a good byproduct in terms of growing more plants. We can definitely talk about the warming impact of it, but it's obviously good in that respect. So, and that happens all the time. There are benign levels of emissions. There are beneficial levels of emissions. There are many phenomena where a very low amount is either not good or is either neutral or even good. You think like sunlight, right? In very high concentrations, sunlight can be very damaging. But if you don't have enough of it, it's very harmful to have. And so there's a kind of sweet spot level of sunlight. It's called a hormetic type of effect. If anyone wants to look up, wants to learn more, there's a really great episode of Power Hour, which is my podcast with Dr. Edward Calabrese, who explains this whole threshold issue in fascinating detail. But the basic idea is that there are healthy and unhealthy levels of everything, from CO2 to emissions, and this is a good segue to the climate thing. We want to ask, when we look at CO2, not are we increasing emissions, but are we at an unhealthy threshold? And you can't assume it until you just look at what is the healthy threshold.
All right. So you wanted to talk a little bit about CO2. Let's dive a little bit into that. What exactly is what's the dispute here? And help us to unpack what it is that we need to do, and what's the dispute?
Well, there's just a fact that when we use fossil fuel energy, which is technically hydrocarbon energy because they're primarily composed of hydrogen and carbon atoms, the way that those are converted to energy is that they're burned, which means oxidized, which means you add oxygen into the mix, the carbon and the hydrogen split, the carbon gets oxygen, becomes CO2, and the hydrogen becomes H2O. And CO2 is what's called an infrared absorber of greenhouse gas, which means that there's a certain spectrum of infrared light that it absorbs, and thus that has a warming impact on the local atmosphere when we isolate this. And so it's an important kind of thing to observe and investigate, but if we want the whole picture, we have to do so very carefully. So one baseline question about it, if we're looking about how big a concern would we expect it to be, is what is the nature and magnitude of this effect? So let's imagine it was like an exponential effect. So every new molecule of CO2 made you faster and faster. It would warm faster and faster. So that'd be equivalent of, you're at 55 miles an hour and you have an exponential effect. So every millimeter you press down on the pedal is going to get you, like the first one's going to get you 5 miles at 10. Right. Then you're just going to be a rocket, which sounds kind of cool there. But in terms of warming, there's some point at which you don't
They're talking about the runaway train
like
effect.
Globally. Exactly.
The runaway
CO2 effect. But when you look at it, it's actually the greenhouse effect is the opposite. It's a decelerating, it's called logarithmic effect. So every new molecule of CO2 adds less warming to its surroundings than the last. And there are reasons for this. Basically, there's only a certain amount of type of infrared light that CO2 can absorb. So basically, every new molecule for CO2 is competing for a finite amount of that spectrum, and so each new one can only absorb so much because it's getting crowded out by the other ones. That's kind of the nature of the mechanism. So then it's really disingenuous for people to act like, oh, science has proven it's a runaway effect, when it's actually a diminishing effect. And so then there's an issue of, well, if that's what it's like when you can isolate it, when it's in the atmosphere along with other effects and other molecules, how does that affect things? And there are a whole bunch of climate models that are based on the assumption that even though CO2 is a diminishing effect, which every climate scientist will agree with, but they won't say it publicly which is very dishonest, because I think it'll confuse people.
Well, it goes against the narrative.
To know how it actually works.
The big government narrative.
Exactly. It goes against the narrative, which is their entire source of funding. But what's happening then is their climate models are charitably based on speculative, very unproven things that say, well, this mild warming of the CO2 is going to be amplified by things like water vapor, and then it's going to go out of control. And this is, I think, implausible for many reasons, including the fact that in the history of, well, it's not entirely, but the history of the Earth has had 20 times more CO2 in the atmosphere. And we're also at a fairly low point in terms of temperature and CO2. So if we were at the Earth high, like the all-time geological high of CO2, and at the all-time temperature high, which I think a lot of people think we are, and we were in unprecedented territory in terms of the Earth's atmosphere, you would have a little bit more reason to be concerned. But if you've already had the most fertile period in the Earth's history was when we had 20 times more CO2, and plants were so big that dinosaurs could eat off of them.
It kind of lays waste to the idea that all this is man-made and that just by a few more government regulations, the whole thing is going to be solved.
Well, the CO2 is man-made, but then the issue, so there's this issue if we want to study what happens with the CO2, but what our baseline assumption would be, there's probably some warming influence but it's probably not that much, and it's probably becoming less significant. And if you look at the temperature increases from the perspective of the temperatures we deal with, it's just very, very small temperature increases and not and pretty lumpy, like not really strongly correlated with. So then you think, okay, that's great. Like from a normal investigation, you think, okay, well, that was interesting to look into. It's probably more interesting that we're getting a lot of fertilization from the plants enjoying that CO2 and us enjoying the plants. And then it's obviously really important that we're getting cheap, plentiful, reliable energy for billions of people. So in terms of human flourishing, the latter two are the ones that seem really significant. But then people don't talk about fossil fuels at all or energy at all. They talk about climate change, which, notice, that's an interesting way to put it, because I put it in terms of CO2, because CO2 is the issue. Right? Is there, say, greenhouse gases? But the question is, does CO2 have this effect? But then if you talk about climate change as a big problem, what you've done is you're no longer focused on the causality and causation of CO2 and what we know about that. You're focused on change of climate, which seems scary. And as you mentioned before, as long as you're on that, what you're now doing is you're now this is another package deal. You're blending together a constant of nature, which is climate change, including climate danger, with man-made climate impact. And you're packaging those together. So what happens is whenever people see something bad in climate, they can say, oh, well, it was the fossil fuels that did it, even though this is apparently very minor thing. And when something is great, when it's a great day, nobody says, oh, thanks, ExxonMobil, for making this happen. I'm really grateful for the perfect. So it's just, we have to completely unpackage this. The way to think of it is think of it in terms of CO2, how significant is that? And then if you want to think about climate, point number one is climate is naturally variable, volatile, and vicious, and it requires humans to master it. So the key problem of climate is not the average temperature or the amount of CO2. It's always going to be rough for humans until we master it using technology, and that technology involves a lot of energy, which is why that the more energy we use, the safer our climate becomes. Even though people think it's more dangerous, we're 1/50th as likely to die from climate as people were 80 years ago, not because nature became nice to us, but because we became nice to ourselves by mastering nature. And so if you want people to be, if you really care about climate, you want lots of fossil fuels, lots of energy to protect us from the naturally hostile
absolutely.
climate.
Well, if let's say that the anti-Earth people were right, well, shouldn't they be thanking the fossil fuel industries for making Earth unlivable for people? And also, if the people who are more concerned with humanity, if they're right as well, that should be the standard of value, then you would think that they would be totally in support of using more and more and more fossil fuels, not the exact opposite, not basically tying our hands behind our back and making us feel guilty when we take out our aerosol sprayer, when we power our homes. I think this is definitely an interesting, totally a kind of a groundbreaking way to look at it, because it actually turns out that that human beings are able to master the environment to the point where we can actually sit here and have these sorts of discussions. Thousands of years ago, we would never have even had this discussion. All we would have been, what we would have done was focus our energy on morphing the environment to a place where we could live in it and not really think about the consequences. Now we can actually think about the consequences and think even more and more long term. And I think it behooves us all, especially the people who say that they care about humanity as such, to sort of give your book a really good read and sort of understand where a lot of the sort of the flaws in their reasoning lie. Now that's another thing that the anti-fossil fuel folks sort of appropriate from folks who support fossil fuels, to think that the appreciation of nature, the appreciation, you can't possibly appreciate nature if you support fossil fuels because they're polluting, they pollute or whatever. They want to monopolize the idea of appreciating nature. What do you have to say about that? Help us unpack that just a little bit.
Well, it's important that supporting fossil fuels is part of supporting human flourishing. And so if you support human flourishing, you want to be able to have an environment that you enjoy living in it. So that, that means all whatever you like. I happen to be a beach fanatic, so I really like the Pacific Ocean. It's just so you don't. I mean, so that's why I don't want a fossil fuel company dumping their waste right. at Laguna Beach, nor do they. Right. So there's just this, in general, there's this demonization of industry and people in industry as well. They're not really humans. Like, they don't care about the same things we do. They want just everything to be polluted. And a lot of these people many people live in the communities that they're working. I mean, they're doing physical labor. They're doing fracking. They're doing other things like that in areas. So so one is, if you're for human flourishing, you should be for both fossil fuels and enjoying nature. But also, you can't enjoy nature without a very, very wealthy civilization where you can really relax because you're not just subsisting, and also where you can go deliberately to really enjoyable places. Like, a friend of mine who's a super nature lover type told me after reading my book, he was saying, I never realized, if I just lived in one forest, even if it's a beautiful forest, I would never really appreciate it. Like, this idea of, I love Alaska and Grand Canyon, Yellowstone. That is not a life option for anybody before cheap, plentiful, reliable energy. So these are all just ways of attacking. All these package deals are ways of attacking what we need to flourish. Now, I'll say that these are, I think, the leaders who are really consciously anti-impact, anti-human. Right. That's who we're really talking about here. But there are many people, including many people probably listening to this, that it's not that what you've done, I think, is you haven't had a super clear framework for thinking about it. And because you haven't had a clear framework, and because the people in media and education haven't, you don't have all the relevant facts. And so my goal is to give people a framework that makes a lot of sense, and then to give them the relevant facts. And the moral case for fossil fuels is definitely the place where I've done that.
That reminds me of a scene from Madagascar. The animals, they break out of the zoo to go to the wide open spaces of the wild, and the penguins finally make it to Antarctica, and it's just this blizzard that's going on, and they're like, well, this sucks. So, there was one more thing I wanted to talk to you. I've got so many questions, but there's been such a heavy propaganda war against fossil fuels, and it seems to be starting at a younger and a younger age. Now, when I was in high school, I used to debate policy, and the resolution when I was in high school was the United States should substantially increase its use of renewable energy. Now, for that entire year in the late 90s, the country's top intellectual minds were sort of steeped in this climate science, with which you basically had to beg the question in order to remain topical, i.e. in order to win a debate, which is that fossil fuels are bad and the bane of human existence. Now, clearly we have an uphill battle in front of us, but the same debaters, those same people who I was debating against in high school, now they're the age to be, they're old enough to be president. Now, even as a young age, when I was in debate, I ran 2 different affirmative cases, and I hadn't even read Ayn Rand at that point, or nor did I understand really what I was doing. I just ended up being attracted to these cases. One of them was deregulation, and the other one was nanotechnology. And of course, I was laughed out of many debate rounds, mainly for the deregulation part. People took the nanotechnology more seriously than the deregulation. So, let's just talk a little bit about what needs to happen. I mean, I think your book should be required reading for high school students. And, but to me, it just seems like an uphill battle right now. What do you think needs to happen in order to sort of shift the narrative to a more, not only to a more human-centric mindset, but one that that promotes human flourishing, but also understands all the nuances of the fossil fuel debate, so that you don't get all these people going out there saying, well, we need to stop the fossil fuel industry for the sake of our own survival. I mean, that just seems like such a, it's so back ass words,
Yes, this is a big question. Unfortunately, we only have 3 minutes left. But this is also a way to, if people are interested in following my stuff, industrialprogress.com is my company, Center for Industrial Progress. And we every week have a newsletter called Movement, which is all about how to change the energy debate. So it's not just keeping up with our stuff, but giving a lot of concrete ideas and tools for how you can become an effective influencer. And the core of it is, I mentioned, framework and facts. And then the other piece of it is learning how to use the right framework and facts in effective conversation with others. I've been developing a lot in the last couple of years what I call a constructive conversation formula, which is how to persuade people who disagree, as long as you have the truth on your side, by structuring conversations in a way where they have a really good operating framework, and people really are explicitly on the premise of let's figure out what's best for human flourishing. So I think that framework is really the key to making things better, and I think it appeals to a lot of people. Obviously, it appealed to you, but it makes an impact wherever I go. So I'd recommend people, I have this centralized thing to join our list and then to send ideas. And one other thing they can do just very concretely is, if you know of other good shows like this, ask them to have me on. I mean, I don't go on every show, but if it's a show with smart people and smart audience, I just find so many great advocates come out of these experiences.
Absolutely.
So with that, that's a good opportunity for me to thank you for having me on. Obviously, you're very philosophical, and I've thought about this a lot. And I hope that my book, combined with your pre-existing mental abilities, will make you
absolutely.
An even more
it was great having
advocate.
you on. Again, we are here with Alex Epstein. He's the author for The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels. We are going to put all of his information down in the show notes. Definitely want to visit his Center for Industrial Progress. It's his think tank where he talks about a whole bunch of fun, controversial issues, and he gets all philosophical, and it's great. He's got a great YouTube page and everything like that. And again, I just want to thanks for having you on. This was a great conversation. I really appreciate it.